September 1st, 1939, 4:45 a.m. The morning mist still hung over the Polish countryside when the sound of engines shattered the silence. From the west, a new kind of army was approaching. Not the slow, grinding advance of the First World War, but something the world had never seen before. Dive bombers screamed out of the sky, their sirens wailing like banshees. Tank columns thundered across the border, dust clouds rising in their wake. Motorized infantry followed close behind in trucks and half-tracks. Communications were severed, command posts were destroyed. Polish forces, still deploying to their defensive positions, found themselves surrounded, cut off, overwhelmed. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And in just 5 weeks, it would conquer Poland. 8 months later, it would crush France in 6 weeks, an enemy that had held out for 4 years in the previous war. Within 2 years, German forces would stand at the gates of Moscow, having conquered more territory than Napoleon ever dreamed of. The word Blitzkrieg conjures images of unstoppable panzer columns, screaming dive bombers, and entire armies collapsing in weeks. It represents one of the most revolutionary military doctrines in history, a way of fighting that combined new technologies with innovative tactics to shatter the stalemate of trench warfare. But Blitzkrieg was more than just tanks and planes. It was a complete philosophy of warfare, a way of thinking about combat that emphasized speed over strength, initiative over obedience, and psychological shock over physical destruction. It was warfare as art, as science, as psychology. Today we examine this doctrine in depth. Where did it come from? How did it work? Why did it succeed so spectacularly? And why did it ultimately fail? This is the complete story of Blitzkrieg, the lightning that struck Europe and changed warfare forever. To understand Blitzkrieg, we must first understand the nightmare it was designed to escape, the Western Front of World War I. From 1914 to 1918, millions of men faced each other across a line of trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland. Protected by barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery, defensive positions had become nearly impregnable. Attackers advancing across no man's land were cut down in their thousands. At the Battle of the Somme, the British suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, the bloodiest day in British military history. Generals on both sides struggled to break the deadlock. They tried longer artillery bombardments, but these only warned the enemy that an attack was coming. They tried poison gas, but it was as dangerous to the attacker as the defender. They introduced the tank in 1916, but used it in small numbers, dispersed among infantry units rather than concentrated for breakthrough. By 1918, 10 million soldiers were dead. Empires had collapsed. And what had been gained? A few miles of devastated landscape, villages that existed only as names on maps, forests reduced to splintered stumps. When the war finally ended, military theorists across the world asked themselves, how do we prevent this from happening again? How do we restore mobility to warfare? How do we break through entrenched defenses without suffering catastrophic casualties? Different nations sought different answers. The French, traumatized by their losses, invested in the Maginot Line, a chain of fortifications designed to make their border impregnable. They would never again suffer an invasion like 1914. The British, relying on their navy and empire, reduced their army and hoped to avoid continental entanglements. The Americans, disillusioned with European wars, retreated into isolationism. But Germany, forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles from having a large military, was forced to think differently. Restricted to an army of just 100,000 men, no tanks, no air force, Limited artillery, German military planners had to focus on quality over quantity, on innovation over mass, on doing more with less. This constraint would prove to be a blessing in disguise. It forced German military thinkers to question everything, to imagine new ways of fighting, to develop doctrines that emphasized skill, speed, and surprise over brute force. The foundation of what would become Blitzkrieg was laid in the 1920s and early 1930s by a small group of innovative military thinkers, both in Germany and abroad. In Britain, Major General J.F.C. Fuller and Captain Basil Liddell Hart were revolutionizing military theory. Fuller, who had planned tank operations in World War I, argued that future wars would be won by massed formations of fast, mechanized forces that could penetrate deep into enemy territory. He envisioned armies operating like the human body, with tanks as the skeleton, motorized infantry as the muscles, and communication networks as the nervous system. Liddell Hart developed the concept of the indirect approach, arguing that attacking the enemy's strong points was wasteful. Instead, find the weak point, exploit it, and strike at the enemy's rear, disrupting their command, supply, and communications. Victory came not from destroying the enemy's forces directly, but from paralyzing their ability to fight. These British theorists influenced military thinking worldwide, ironically having more impact on Germany than their own country. The British Army remained skeptical, viewing tanks as infantry support weapons rather than decisive strike forces. In Germany, Hans von Seeckt, who commanded the Reichswehr from 1920 to 1926, rebuilt the German army from the ground up. Seeckt emphasized mobility, combined arms cooperation, and decentralized command. Every officer was trained to take initiative, to make decisions, to exploit opportunities without waiting for orders from above. This concept, called Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, would become central to Blitzkrieg. Seeckt also established secret cooperation with the Soviet Union, allowing German officers to train on tanks and aircraft forbidden by Versailles, and to study modern warfare techniques away from Allied inspectors. Then there was Heinz Guderian, the man most associated with Blitzkrieg doctrine. A signals officer in World War I, Guderian became obsessed with tanks and mobile warfare. He devoured the writings of Fuller and Liddell Hart. He studied the limited tank actions of 1918, and he became convinced that tanks were not support weapons for infantry, but should operate independently in massed formations as the main striking force. Guderian's vision was radical. He imagined entire divisions composed of tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and anti-aircraft guns, all moving together at the speed of the tanks. These panzer divisions would concentrate at a weak point, smash through enemy lines, then race deep into enemy territory, disrupting communications, destroying supply depots, and creating chaos before the enemy could react. In the air, Wolfram von Richthofen, cousin of the famous Red Baron, developed concepts of close air support. Rather than treating aircraft as a separate service fighting its own air war, von Richthofen envisioned planes working directly with ground forces, acting as flying artillery to destroy enemy defenses just ahead of advancing tanks. But Germany wasn't the only nation developing these ideas. The Soviet Union created large mechanized corps in the 1930s. France had more and better tanks than Germany in 1940. So why did Germany succeed where others failed? The answer lies not just in technology or tactics, but in organization, training, and most importantly, in culture and command philosophy. What set the German military apart wasn't superior equipment. In 1939, many German tanks were actually inferior to French or British models. The Panzer I and II were lightly armed training tanks pressed into combat service.
Even the Panzer III and IV, Germany's main battle tanks, were not dramatically superior to Allied counterparts. The difference was in how they used what they had. German officers were trained to show initiative. The mission-type tactics, Auftragstaktik, Taktik, meant that a commander was told what to achieve, not how to achieve it. This created a military culture where taking calculated risks was encouraged, where exploiting unexpected opportunities was expected, where waiting for orders was seen as a failure of leadership. This was radically different from Allied armies, particularly the French, where centralized command meant junior officers often had to wait hours or even days for permission to act. By the time approval came, the opportunity had passed. German units also practiced combined arms cooperation extensively. Tank crews, infantry, artillery, engineers, and air liaison officers trained together constantly. They developed shared understanding, common procedures, and mutual trust. When battle came, they worked together smoothly because they had already worked together hundreds of times in exercises. Communication was another key advantage. German tanks had radios, allowing tank commanders to communicate with each other and with higher headquarters. This seems obvious today, but in 1940, most French tanks had no radios. French tank commanders had to stop, dismount, and use hand signals or written messages to coordinate with other tanks. This made rapid reaction and exploitation of opportunities nearly impossible. German tactical doctrine also emphasized the Schwerpunkt, or point of main effort. Rather than attacking everywhere equally, concentrate overwhelming force at one decisive point. Break through there, then exploit the breach before the enemy can react. This required careful reconnaissance and intelligence. Where was the enemy weak? Where were the gaps? Where could a breakthrough achieve the most disruption? German reconnaissance units, using motorcycles, armored cars, and aircraft, probed enemy defenses constantly, seeking that crucial weak point. Finally, there was leadership. German junior officers and NCOs were trained to lead from the front. Tank commanders fought with their heads out of the hatch, better to see and react to the battlefield, despite the danger. This created faster decision-making and better situational awareness than commanders fighting from the safety of headquarters far behind the lines. All of these elements, technology, tactics, training, doctrine, and culture, would come together in September 1939 in the fields and forests of Poland. Poland was where Blitzkrieg would face its first real test, and it was a test the world was watching closely. Germany's strategic situation in August 1939 was challenging. Poland had a large, brave army of over 1 million men. The French army, supposedly the world's strongest, was mobilizing on Germany's western border. Britain had guaranteed Polish independence. If the war bogged down into a prolonged campaign like World War I, Germany would face enemies on two fronts and likely lose. Hitler needed a quick victory. The question was whether the new German way of war could deliver it. On the night of August 31st, German forces took their positions along the Polish border. The attack would come from three directions: Army Group North attacking from East Prussia toward Warsaw, Army Group South striking from Silesia and Slovakia, and a smaller force attacking from the west. The pincers were designed to encircle and destroy the Polish army before it could retreat to defensive positions along major rivers. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, without a declaration of war, the attack began. The Luftwaffe struck first. In carefully coordinated raids, German bombers attacked Polish airfields, targeting planes on the ground. Within hours, much of the Polish Air Force was destroyed. This gave Germany air superiority, crucial for what would follow. Next came what would become a signature of Blitzkrieg: attacks on communications and command centers. German bombers struck telegraph offices, radio stations, bridges, and railway junctions. Polish commanders found themselves unable to communicate with their units. Orders couldn't get through. Reports from the front were delayed or never arrived. The fog of war descended immediately. Then the ground forces struck. The German attack began with artillery barrages targeting Polish defensive positions. But these weren't the prolonged bombardments of World War I. After just minutes or hours, the artillery lifted and the attack came. Stukas, the Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, screamed down on Polish positions. Equipped with sirens called Jericho trumpets, they created a terrifying wail deliberately designed to break enemy morale. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. Behind the Stukas came the Panzers. Guderian's 19th Corps, with over 800 tanks and motorized infantry, smashed through Polish defenses in the corridor separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The speed was shocking. Within 48 hours, German forces had advanced over 50 miles. Polish forces fought bravely and sometimes effectively. At Mokra, the Wolinska Cavalry Brigade, fighting dismounted behind hastily dug trenches, defeated an attack by the 4th Panzer Division. At Wiesna, 720 Polish soldiers held off 42,000 Germans for 3 days. Polish cavalry, contrary to myth, did not charge tanks with lances. They were reconnaissance and mobile infantry, not medieval knights. But these were isolated successes in a deteriorating situation. The speed of the German advance was creating chaos. Polish units, deployed to defend the entire lengthy border, found themselves outflanked and encircled. The Poznan army tried to counterattack German forces advancing on Warsaw, but the attack was too slow and too late. By September 6th, just 5 days into the campaign, Krakow had fallen. German forces were approaching Warsaw from the west and northwest. The Polish government was preparing to evacuate the capital. Then came the decisive moment. On September 9th, Polish forces launched the Battle of Bzura, the largest counteroffensive of the campaign. For a moment, it seemed the Polish Poznan and Pomerose armies might break through and stabilize the front. But the German response demonstrated the flexibility of Blitzkrieg doctrine. German forces immediately reoriented. Units that had been racing toward Warsaw turned to meet the threat. The Luftwaffe redirected its attacks. Within days, the Polish counteroffensive was surrounded. By September 19th, the Bzura pocket was destroyed. Over 170,000 Polish troops were captured. Meanwhile, Warsaw came under siege. The Polish garrison refused to surrender, despite devastating bombardment. On September 25th, the Luftwaffe conducted one of its heaviest raids of the war, dropping 560 tons of high explosive and 72 tons of incendiary bombs on the city. This deliberate attack on a civilian population was a war crime, a dark side of Blitzkrieg often overlooked. The final blow came from the east. On September 17th, following the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. Polish forces, already reeling from the German onslaught, now faced a two-front war they could not win. On September 27th, Warsaw surrendered. The last organized Polish resistance ended on October 6th. In just 5 weeks, Poland had been conquered. Germany had achieved the quick victory Hitler demanded. The world took notice, but many drew the wrong conclusions. Western military observers noted Poland's outdated equipment, its impossible strategic position between two enemies, its decision to defend the entire border rather than falling back to defensible river lines. They convinced themselves that Poland was a special case, that modern armies like France could never be defeated so quickly. They were about to learn how wrong they were. After Poland's conquest, an eerie quiet descended on Western Europe. This period, from October 1939 to May 1940, became known as the Phony War, or as the Germans mockingly called it, the Blitzkrieg, the Sitting War. French and British forces faced German positions along the western border, but neither side launched major offensives. French troops manned the Maginot Line, the massive chain of fortifications built in the 1930s to prevent another German invasion. Behind this concrete shield, they waited. Hitler wanted to attack immediately. At a conference on September 27th, even before Poland had completely fallen, he ordered preparations for an offensive in the west. His generals were horrified. They argued that the army needed time to refit and retrain after the Polish campaign, that winter weather would make operations difficult, that France was a far more formidable opponent than Poland. Hitler reluctantly agreed to postpone the attack, but only until November. This deadline was pushed back repeatedly due to weather and logistics, each delay giving Germany more time to prepare and, fatefully, to reconsider its strategy. The initial plan, called Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, was conventional and uninspired. The main thrust would come through Belgium and the Netherlands, essentially repeating the Schlieffen Plan of 1914. Allied forces were expected to move into Belgium to meet this attack, and that's where the major battle would occur. Senior German generals like Franz Halder and Walther von Brauchitsch supported this plan, but others found it lacking. Most notably, Erich von Manstein, Chief of Staff to Army Group A, thought it was too predictable. Yes, Germany might win, but it would be a costly slugging match, another Verdun, exactly what Blitzkrieg was supposed to avoid. Manstein proposed something radical. Rather than making the main attack where the enemy expected it, through the flat terrain of northern Belgium, concentrate the main effort further south, through the Ardennes forest. The French considered the Ardennes impassable to large mechanized forces. If 7 panzer divisions could get through the impassable forest, they could cross the Meuse River, break out into open country, and race to the English Channel, cutting off all Allied forces in Belgium. It was an enormous gamble. The panzer divisions would be strung out in a narrow column through the Ardennes, vulnerable if discovered. If the French reacted quickly, they could cut the corridor and destroy Germany's entire armored force. The entire campaign would be decided in the first few days. Success or catastrophe. No middle ground. Manstein's superiors rejected the plan as too risky. Frustrated, Manstein used every opportunity to promote his ideas, making himself so annoying that he was effectively promoted to command an infantry corps to get him away from headquarters. But Manstein had allies. Guderian loved the plan because it gave his panzers the starring role. And somehow Manstein's ideas reached Hitler. Whether through Guderian or through other channels, Hitler heard the proposal and immediately grasped its potential. On February 17, 1940, Hitler met with Manstein and questioned him in detail about the plan. Hitler loved audacity. He loved the idea of doing what the enemy thought was impossible. He loved the psychological impact of attacking where they felt safe. Over the objections of more conservative generals, Hitler approved Manstein's plan. The main attack would come through the Ardennes. Army Group A, with 7 panzer divisions, would have the decisive role. Army Group B would attack the Netherlands and northern Belgium, but this was now a feint, designed to draw Allied forces north while the real blow fell further south. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, operations that demonstrated Blitzkrieg principles could work even in difficult terrain and against prepared defenses. The successful use of airborne troops and amphibious assaults added new dimensions to mobile warfare. Now everything was ready for the main event, the conquest of France, the nation with supposedly the world's strongest army, protected by the formidable Maginot Line. German forces had been honed to a razor's edge. The plan was audacious. The question was, would it work? On May 9th, Hitler gave the final order. The attack would begin the next morning.
May 10, 1940, 5:30 a.m. Along a front stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, German forces surged forward. In the north, Army Group B attacked the Netherlands and Belgium. Paratroopers dropped on key bridges. Gliders landed silently near critical objectives. One of the most audacious operations targeted Fort Eben-Emael, Belgium's most powerful fortress, considered impregnable with its garrison of 1,200 men protected by thick concrete and steel. At dawn, 9 gliders carrying just 85 German engineers landed directly on top of the fortress. Using hollow-charge explosives, they destroyed the fort's gun emplacements and sealed the garrison inside. Within 24 hours, Fort Eben-Emael surrendered. It was a stunning demonstration of how Blitzkrieg thinking could revolutionize even special operations. The attacks in the north achieved their objective. As planned, French and British forces rushed into Belgium to meet what they assumed was the main German attack. The French 7th Army raced north into the Netherlands. The British Expeditionary Force moved to positions along the Dyle River in Belgium. These were the best Allied troops, the most mobile units, advancing exactly where the Germans wanted them. Meanwhile, 100 miles to the south, the real attack was developing in the Ardennes. 7 panzer divisions, over 1,200 tanks, and 41,000 vehicles pushed through the forest roads in a column stretching over 100 miles. Traffic jams developed as units bottlenecked at bridges and narrow passages. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. If French reconnaissance aircraft had spotted this massive column and bombed it, the entire campaign could have ended in disaster. But French air reconnaissance was minimal. The few pilots who did report large German columns in the Ardennes were not believed. The Ardennes was impassable. Everyone knew that. The reports must be exaggerated. By the evening of May 12th, German forces had reached the Meuse River at Sedan, Monthermé, and Dinant. Now came the critical test. Rivers were the classic defensive obstacle. Throughout history, crossing a defended river had been one of the most difficult military operations. The attacker had to get troops across under fire, establish a bridgehead, and hold it long enough to build bridges for tanks and heavy equipment. Conventional doctrine said to pause, bring up heavy artillery, prepare methodically for several days, then attack with overwhelming fire support. But Blitzkrieg doctrine said attack immediately. Speed was protection. Strike before the enemy could reinforce, before they could prepare. Guderian, commanding 19th Panzer Corps, insisted on attacking the next day, May 13th. His superiors were nervous, but Guderian was adamant. The Luftwaffe would provide the heavy firepower that artillery normally supplied. May 13, 1940. The attack on Sedan began at 4 p.m. For the previous 8 hours, the Luftwaffe had pounded French positions in the most concentrated air attack in history up to that point. Over 1,000 sorties, wave after wave of bombers, particularly Stukas, diving on French bunkers and artillery positions. The psychological effect was devastating. French defenders, many of them reservists rather than frontline troops, huddled in their bunkers as bombs exploded all around. Communications broke down. Some units panicked. Under this aerial umbrella, German infantry crossed the Meuse in rubber boats. Combat engineers worked frantically under fire to build pontoon bridges. French artillery and machine guns took a toll, but the attacks were uncoordinated. Some French units fought fiercely, others broke and fled. By nightfall, German forces had established several bridgeheads across the Meuse.
This was the decisive moment of the entire campaign. If the French had launched a strong, coordinated counterattack on the night of May 13th or the morning of May 14th, they might have destroyed the fragile bridgeheads and ended the German offensive. But the French response was confused and piecemeal. French commanders didn't grasp the scale of the threat. Reports from the front were delayed or contradictory. Counterattacks were ordered, then canceled, then ordered again. When attacks finally came, they were uncoordinated, hitting one bridgehead at a time rather than all simultaneously. By the afternoon of May 14th, German engineers had completed the first pontoon bridges across the Meuse at Sedan. Tanks began crossing. The bridgehead was secure and expanding rapidly. Now the panzers were loose in open country beyond the Meuse, and nothing stood between them and the English Channel. What happened next was unprecedented in military history. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps began a headlong dash west toward the English Channel, not advancing carefully, consolidating gains, ensuring secure flanks. Racing forward at maximum speed, sometimes covering 40 miles in a day, faster than anyone thought possible for a large military formation. Behind Guderian came two more Panzer Corps, Reinhardt's XII and Hoth's XV. Together they formed a narrow corridor of German armor driving deep into France, with the bulk of the French army still to the north in Belgium. French commanders struggled to understand what was happening. Where were the Germans? How many? What was their objective? Reports were confused, often contradictory. Telephone lines were cut. Radio communications were poor. The speed of the German advance was creating a fog of war that paralyzed French decision-making. This was exactly what Blitzkrieg was designed to achieve. The physical destruction of enemy forces was secondary. The primary goal was to paralyze the enemy's ability to think, to decide, to coordinate. By the time French commanders figured out what was happening and ordered a response, the situation had already changed. Some French units fought skillfully. Colonel Charles de Gaulle led an armored counterattack at Montcornet on May 17th that temporarily disrupted German operations. But these were isolated actions. There was no coordinated French response because coordination had become impossible. The German advance was not without problems. Supply lines were stretched thin. Units were spread out. The flanks of the corridor were vulnerable. Several times Hitler and the German High Command ordered the panzers to halt and wait for infantry to catch up. Each time, Guderian argued for continuing the advance, sometimes exceeding or creatively interpreting his orders. This tension between caution at headquarters and aggression at the front highlighted a fundamental characteristic of Blitzkrieg. It required commanders at all levels to take risks, to push forward even when it seemed dangerous. The doctrine only worked if junior commanders showed initiative and aggressiveness. On May 20th, just 10 days after the offensive began, German tanks reached the English Channel at Abbeville. They had advanced 240 miles from the Meuse. The Allied armies in Belgium were cut off, trapped in a pocket between Army Group B attacking from the east and Army Group A closing in from the south and west. The situation was catastrophic for the Allies. The British Expeditionary Force, the French First Army, and the Belgian Army were all caught in what the Germans called the cauldron. Behind them was the sea. Ahead of them, German tanks. It seemed like complete destruction was inevitable. But then, something unexpected happened. On May 24th, German panzer divisions were just 10 miles from Dunkirk, the last port through which Allied forces might escape. Guderian's tanks were ready to finish the job. Then came the infamous halt order. Hitler ordered the panzers to stop. For 3 days they sat idle while trapped Allied forces fell back to Dunkirk. The reasons for this order remain debated by historians. Some argue Hitler wanted to preserve the panzers for the next phase of operations. Others suggest Göring convinced him the Luftwaffe could finish the job. Some even speculate Hitler hoped Britain would be more willing to negotiate peace if he didn't completely humiliate their army. Whatever the reason, it gave the British a chance. On May 26th, Operation Dynamo began, the evacuation from Dunkirk. Over 9 days, an improvised armada of destroyers, ferries, fishing boats, pleasure craft, and anything else that could float crossed the English Channel and brought soldiers back to Britain. The evacuation was conducted under constant air attack and artillery fire. Ships were sunk. Thousands of men died in the water. But by June 4th, 338,000 British, French, and Belgian troops had been evacuated, far more than anyone thought possible. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. But Dunkirk was not a victory. As Churchill himself said, wars are not won by evacuations. The troops were saved, but they left behind all their heavy equipment: tanks, artillery, vehicles, ammunition. Britain had been driven from the continent, and France's ordeal was far from over. After Dunkirk, there was a brief pause as German forces regrouped. Then on June 5th, they launched Fall Rot, Case Red, the attack on the remaining French forces south of the Somme. France still had significant forces, approximately 65 divisions, and they had learned some lessons from the first phase. French commanders understood now that they faced a new kind of warfare. They established defense in depth, prepared to counterattack against breakthroughs, and tried to coordinate their responses better. But it was too late. French forces were demoralized and disorganized. The best units had been lost in Belgium. Equipment was scarce. Most critically, the psychological shock of the First German offensive had broken French confidence. Defeat seemed inevitable. The German attack, using the same Blitzkrieg principles, quickly broke through French defenses. Panzer divisions raced south and west, creating multiple pockets of encircled French troops. City after city fell: Rouen, Reims, Orleans. The French government fled Paris for Tours, then to Bordeaux. On June 10th, Italy declared war and invaded southern France. Mussolini wanted to share in the spoils of victory. Italian forces made minimal progress against fierce French resistance in the Alps, but the psychological impact of this stab in the back was profound. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris. The French had declared it an open city to spare it from destruction. Swastika flags flew from the Eiffel Tower. German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées. The humiliation was complete. The French government was in chaos. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud wanted to continue fighting, perhaps from North Africa. But his military commander, 84-year-old Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun in World War I, argued that further resistance was futile and would only bring more suffering. On June 17th, Pétain became prime minister and immediately asked for an armistice. Hitler insisted that France surrender in the same railroad car, in the same location in the forest of Compiègne, where Germany had signed the armistice, ending World War I. This symbolic humiliation was deliberate. On June 22, 1940, the armistice was signed. France was divided into occupied and unoccupied zones. The French fleet was neutralized. Prisoners of war would remain in German captivity. France, which had withstood 4 years of German assault in World War I, had collapsed in just 6 weeks. It was the greatest triumph of Blitzkrieg, the vindication of everything Guderian, Manstein, and others had theorized. A nation with a larger population, more tanks, and supposedly the world's strongest army had been utterly defeated. How had this happened? The technical explanations are well known. German tanks were concentrated while French tanks were dispersed. German forces had superior communications and coordination.
German doctrine emphasized speed, while French doctrine emphasized methodical advance. But the deeper explanation is psychological. Blitzkrieg succeeded because it operated inside the enemy's decision cycle. It moved faster than French commanders could think, creating situations that changed before responses could be implemented. It induced a kind of paralysis, a sense that nothing could stop the German advance, that resistance was futile. This psychological dimension was as important as the tanks and dive bombers. Blitzkrieg was as much about breaking the enemy's will as destroying their forces. But there was also a dark side to this success. The destruction of Rotterdam by German bombing, the deliberate attacks on refugee columns clogging roads, the terror bombing of cities. These were not accidents or excesses. They were features of Blitzkrieg, designed to spread panic and paralyze civilian populations as well as military forces. Now, with France defeated, Hitler turned his attention to Britain. Could Blitzkrieg work across the English Channel? Britain now stood alone. Churchill had become Prime Minister on May 10th, the very day Germany invaded the West. He had warned for years about the Nazi threat. Now his warnings had come true, and he faced the task of defending Britain against invasion. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate peace. With France defeated, with the British Army having lost its equipment at Dunkirk, what was the point of continuing? He even made what he considered generous peace offers. But Churchill rejected them. Britain would fight on. For Germany to invade Britain, Operation Sea Lion, they needed control of the English Channel. For that, they needed to destroy the Royal Air Force. Thus began the Battle of Britain, the first major military campaign fought entirely in the air. This would prove to be Blitzkrieg's first major failure, and it revealed the doctrine's fundamental limitations. The problem was that Blitzkrieg was designed for land warfare. It was about tanks and infantry working together, about penetrating enemy lines and driving deep into the rear, about encircling enemy forces and disrupting their command and supply. But you can't encircle an enemy air force. You can't use combined arms tactics in air-to-air combat. The principles that had worked brilliantly on land didn't translate to the air. The Luftwaffe began by attacking RAF airfields and radar stations. The strategy was sound: destroy British fighters on the ground and eliminate the early warning system. From July through early September, the air battle raged. British pilots, flying Hurricanes and Spitfires, fought desperately against superior numbers. But Britain had crucial advantages. Radar provided early warning, allowing fighters to intercept German raids. British pilots were fighting over their own territory. Downed pilots who survived could return to duty the next day. German fighters, operating at the extreme edge of their range, had limited time over Britain before they had to return to base. By early September, RAF Fighter Command was stretched to the breaking point. Airfields were damaged. Pilots were exhausted. If the Germans had continued attacking the RAF for another few weeks, Britain might have lost. Then Hitler made a critical error. On September 7th, angered by a British bombing raid on Berlin, he ordered the Luftwaffe to switch targets from airfields to London. The Blitz, the sustained bombing campaign against British cities, had begun. This gave the RAF time to recover. British fighter production increased. New pilots completed training. By mid-September, Fighter Command was stronger than it had been in early September. On September 15th, now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, the RAF inflicted heavy losses on German bomber formations. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Britain had survived. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that Blitzkrieg had limits. It was a brilliant doctrine for land warfare, but it couldn't solve every military problem.
Air superiority couldn't be achieved through lightning strikes and rapid maneuver. It required sustained attrition, something Blitzkrieg was designed to avoid. Unable to invade Britain, Hitler would make a decision that would prove fatal to the Third Reich. He would turn east toward the Soviet Union, and Blitzkrieg would face its greatest test. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. Along an 1,800-mile front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 3 million German troops, supported by Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and Finnish forces, surged across the Soviet border. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun. It was Blitzkrieg on an unprecedented, almost unimaginable scale. 4 panzer groups with 3,600 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, 600,000 vehicles, 625,000 horses. This was the largest military operation in human history, and it would determine whether Blitzkrieg could work against a continental-sized enemy. The initial assault seemed like Poland and France all over again, but magnified tenfold. Soviet forces were caught by surprise despite numerous intelligence warnings that Stalin had ignored. German aircraft destroyed over 1,200 Soviet planes on the first day, most of them on the ground. Communication networks were severed. Soviet commanders found themselves isolated, unable to coordinate responses. The panzer groups drove deep into Soviet territory. Massive encirclements trapped entire Soviet armies. At Minsk, 300,000 Soviet troops were surrounded. At Smolensk, another 300,000. At Kiev, an astounding 665,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in the largest encirclement in military history. By September, German forces had advanced up to 600 miles. Leningrad was under siege. Kiev had fallen. Army Group Center was driving on Moscow. The Soviet Union appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Hitler and his generals began planning for victory celebrations. But appearances were deceiving. For all its spectacular advances, Barbarossa was revealing fundamental problems with applying Blitzkrieg to a war of this scale. First, there was the problem of space. In Poland and France, panzer divisions could reach strategically decisive objectives like Warsaw or the English Channel in days or weeks. In the Soviet Union, distances were vast. Even after advancing 600 miles, German forces were still hundreds of miles from objectives like Moscow or the Caucasus oil fields. Second, there was the problem of logistics. Blitzkrieg relied on speed, but speed consumed enormous amounts of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Supply lines stretched longer with each advance. The Soviet rail network used a different gauge than European railways, requiring time-consuming conversion. Roads, such as they were, turned to mud in autumn rains and were buried under snow in winter. Third, there was the weather. Barbarossa was planned as a quick summer campaign to be completed before winter. But the invasion didn't begin until late June, delayed by Hitler's decision to first conquer Yugoslavia and Greece. Autumn rains came in October, turning roads to mud that immobilized vehicles. Then came winter, the harshest in decades. German troops, equipped for a summer campaign, found themselves fighting in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Vehicles wouldn't start, weapons froze, men died of exposure. The Blitzkrieg had ground to a halt not because of enemy action, but because of geography and climate. Fourth, and most importantly, there was the Soviet response. Unlike Poland and France, the Soviet Union didn't collapse psychologically. Yes, they took staggering losses. Yes, entire armies were destroyed. But they kept fighting. They fell back. They traded space for time, and they learned. Stalin, after his initial panic, rallied. The Soviet government remained functional. Industry was evacuated east of the Urals, beyond German reach. New armies were raised. By December, when German forces finally reached the outskirts of Moscow and could see the Kremlin spires, they faced fresh Soviet divisions brought from Siberia. On December 5th, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive. German forces, exhausted and frozen, were driven back. It was the first major German defeat of the war. Hitler's Blitzkrieg had failed to achieve its objective of destroying the Soviet Union in a single campaign. The war in the East would continue for nearly 4 more years. It would become a grinding war of attrition, a slugging match, exactly the kind of warfare Blitzkrieg was designed to avoid. The Soviet Union would ultimately suffer approximately 27 million deaths, the highest toll of any nation in World War II. But they would survive, and they would learn to beat Germany at its own game. By 1943, Soviet forces were conducting their own Blitzkrieg-style operations. Deep battle doctrine, developed by Soviet theorists in the 1930s but poorly implemented early in the war, was refined and perfected. Soviet tank armies, supported by massive artillery barrages and ground attack aircraft, would smash through German lines and drive deep into the rear using the same principles of speed, concentration, and disruption that Germany had pioneered. The student had become the master, and the lightning that had struck so brilliantly in 1939 and 1940 found itself facing an enemy that understood its principles and could match its execution.
By 1943, Blitzkrieg, as Germany practiced it, was effectively dead. The Wehrmacht would continue to fight skillfully, often brilliantly, but it could no longer achieve the rapid, decisive victories that had characterized the early war years. Why did Blitzkrieg ultimately fail? The reasons are multiple and interconnected. First, Germany faced the problem of strategic overreach. Blitzkrieg was designed for quick, decisive campaigns against single opponents. It worked brilliantly against Poland, then France, then in the early stages of Barbarossa. But Hitler's ambitions expanded faster than Germany's ability to sustain them. By late 1941, Germany was fighting Britain, the Soviet Union, and soon the United States simultaneously. No operational doctrine, however brilliant, could compensate for this strategic imbalance. Second, opponents learned and adapted. The British analyzed their defeat in France and reorganized their forces. The Soviets, after catastrophic initial losses, developed countermeasures. They learned to attack the flanks of German penetrations, to avoid encirclement, to establish defense in depth. By 1943, Soviet commanders understood Blitzkrieg better than many German generals. Third, Blitzkrieg required resources Germany increasingly lacked. It consumed enormous amounts of fuel, which Germany, without secure access to oil fields, struggled to provide. It required mechanized forces, but German industry couldn't produce enough vehicles. Throughout the war, the German army relied heavily on horses for transportation, undermining the mobility that Blitzkrieg required. Fourth, there was the problem of scale. Blitzkrieg worked in theaters where decisive objectives could be reached quickly. The Channel ports in 1940, specific cities or geographic features. In the vast expanses of the Soviet Union or the deserts of North Africa, rapid advances often led nowhere strategically significant. Taking territory was not the same as winning the war. Fifth, and perhaps most fundamentally, Blitzkrieg was a tactical and operational doctrine, not a strategic one. It could win battles and even campaigns brilliantly, but it couldn't answer the question of what to do after victory. What if the enemy didn't surrender?
What if they kept fighting from beyond the range of your tanks? Blitzkrieg had no answer for this. Yet, for its ultimate failure, Blitzkrieg's impact on military history was profound and lasting. It demonstrated that the stalemate of trench warfare was not inevitable, that mobility could be restored to the battlefield. It showed the power of combined arms operations, of integrating different military branches into a coordinated whole. It proved the importance of speed, initiative, and exploiting enemy weaknesses. These remain the foundations of mobile warfare. But Blitzkrieg also had a dark legacy often overlooked in military analysis. It was designed not just to defeat enemy armies, but to terrorize civilian populations. The bombing of Rotterdam and Warsaw, the deliberate attacks on refugee columns, the terror of the Stuka's sirens, these were not accidents or excesses by rogue commanders. They were features of the doctrine, deliberate attempts to spread panic and break civilian morale. Moreover, Blitzkrieg's early successes convinced Hitler and his inner circle that Germany could win quick victories anywhere, leading to strategic overreach and ultimately catastrophic defeat. The very brilliance of the doctrine in 1939-1940 blinded German leadership to its limitations. There's a fundamental paradox at the heart of Blitzkrieg. It was the most modern, innovative military doctrine of its time, combining new technologies with revolutionary tactics. Yet it was also, in a sense, deeply conservative. Blitzkrieg was designed to avoid the attritional warfare of World War I. German military planners, traumatized by the trenches, sought a way to win wars quickly without bleeding the nation white. This was understandable, even admirable, as a purely military goal. But this focus on quick victory made Blitzkrieg unsuitable for the kind of total war that World War II became. Once the initial Blitzkrieg campaigns failed to force enemy surrender, once Germany found itself in a prolonged, multi-front war, the doctrine that had brought such spectacular early success became increasingly irrelevant. There's also a technological paradox. Blitzkrieg is often portrayed as triumphing through superior technology, through tanks and planes that overwhelmed more primitive opponents. But this wasn't true. In 1940, France had more and generally better tanks than Germany. The Char B-1 and Samua S-35 were superior to most German tanks. The RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes were competitive or superior to German fighters. The German advantage wasn't technological, but organizational, doctrinal, and cultural. They used what they had more effectively. They concentrated forces while enemies dispersed them. They empowered junior officers while enemies centralized command. They emphasized speed while enemies emphasized methodical planning. This suggests an uncomfortable truth. In warfare, how you use your resources often matters more than what resources you have. Superior equipment helps, but superior doctrine and leadership can overcome material disadvantages, at least for a time. Finally, there's a moral paradox. Blitzkrieg can be studied purely as military innovation, as doctrine and tactics. But it cannot be separated from the regime that employed it and the purposes for which it was used. Blitzkrieg was the tool of Nazi aggression. It enabled the conquest of Europe, the occupation that followed, and ultimately the Holocaust. The cities destroyed, the refugees strafed on roads, the civilians terrorized by bombing. These were not incidental to Blitzkrieg, but integral to it. The doctrine sought not just to defeat enemy armies, but to break the will of entire populations. Can we study Blitzkrieg's tactical innovations while condemning its strategic purposes? Military historians do this routinely, analyzing tactics and operations while noting the moral horror of the causes they served. But the tension remains. Blitzkrieg was lightning war. And, like lightning, it was spectacular, devastating, and brief.
For less than 2 years, from September 1939 to late 1941, it seemed unstoppable. Poland fell in 5 weeks, France in 6, Yugoslavia in 11 days, Greece in 3 weeks. German forces advanced to the gates of Moscow and the outskirts of Alexandria. Then the lightning flickered and died. Germany found itself in the grinding, attritional warfare that Blitzkrieg was designed to avoid. The tide turned at Moscow, at Stalingrad, at El Alamein, at Kursk. By 1943, Germany was being pushed back on all fronts. By 1945, the Third Reich lay in ruins. What are we to make of this history? What lessons does Blitzkrieg offer nearly 85 years later? First, tactical brilliance cannot compensate for strategic folly. Germany's early victories, as spectacular as they were, could not overcome the fundamental imbalance of fighting Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States simultaneously. No operational doctrine, however innovative, can win a war against overwhelming material and demographic superiority. Second, military innovation matters, but so does adaptation. The Allies didn't defeat Germany by copying Blitzkrieg, though they learned from it. They defeated Germany by leveraging their own advantages: industrial production, strategic bombing, code breaking, and eventually the development of doctrines suited to their own strengths. Third, speed and initiative remain crucial in warfare. In an age of precision weapons, satellite surveillance, and cyber warfare, the core Blitzkrieg principles of moving inside the enemy's decision cycle and maintaining tempo are more relevant than ever. Fourth, combined arms integration, coordinating different military branches into a seamless whole, is still the foundation of effective military operations. Whether it's tanks and dive bombers in 1940 or drones and cyber attacks today, success comes from making different capabilities work together. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the relationship between military means and political ends. Blitzkrieg was a tool, and, like any tool, its value depended on the purposes for which it was used. In the hands of Nazi Germany, it enabled aggression, conquest, and ultimately genocide. The men who developed Blitzkrieg were, in many cases, brilliant military theorists. Guderian's writings on armored warfare remain studied today. Manstein was one of the finest operational commanders of the war, but their brilliance served a monstrous cause. This reminds us that military innovation is not morally neutral. The question is not just, does it work? But what does it serve? Today, when we study Blitzkrieg in military academies, when we analyze its tactics and operations, we should remember the full context. The lightning that struck Europe in 1939 to 1941 illuminated a landscape of conquest and suffering. And the thunder that followed, the prolonged warfare from 1941 to 1945, ultimately brought destruction to the nation that unleashed the storm. Blitzkrieg changed warfare forever. Its principles influence military doctrine to this day. But its story is also a cautionary tale about the limits of tactical brilliance, the dangers of strategic overreach, and the ultimate futility of aggression. The lightning was real. The thunder was inevitable. And when the storm finally passed, Europe lay in ruins, and the world had learned, at terrible cost, that there are no shortcuts to victory in total war.